When I was a kid, I just about lived in the movies, especially art houses. They wouldn't let me through the door, of course, for fear I'd be corrupted by these dirty films. Now, there's a threat that'll make a teenager think twice about how to get through the fire door. But, surprise, instead of sex, I got the whole history of European film from Potemkin to 400 Blows. Suddenly, one night, I stumbled into the only American flick these art houses ever screened, the famous Citizen Kane. I was ready to be blown away. But at fade out, I leaned back and thought, interesting. Which, of course, is the word we use when we really mean, I felt nothing. So I kept screening it over the years, searching for the heart of Citizen Kane, only to discover I was looking in the wrong place. It's not in the film, but after the film, in the post-movie ritual of chat about symbols and style and lighting effects. The film has no heart. It's interesting. Ammunition for cafe criticism. Yet, critics tell us, Citizen Kane is the greatest film of all time.
Legendary was the film Citizen Kane. Legendary already at its birth in 1941. Almost as legendary was its creator, world's most famous cinematic prodigy, the young Orson Welles. Invited from Triumph with the Mercury Theater on Broadway and on radio to go to Hollywood. And so, with all the talents of the RKO studio, he worked to tell the story of Charles Foster Kane. This story, believed by many to be based on William Randolph Hearst, tells instead the tale of a young boy, snatched from his family by sudden wealth, raised by a banker. He becomes a newspaper tycoon, marries well, is disgraced, marries again, and tries foolishly to make his talentless wife an opera star. She leaves him, and then, as to all it must, death to him finally in his palace Xanadu comes. No great crowds on first release, perhaps, but critics loved Citizen Kane. 50 years on, Kane is still worshipped, screened, even taught. For 3 decades, Kane has been the critic's choice, the king of film.
It changes your life. See the film changes your life. And that, I think, is the mark of a masterpiece.
I think I would rate it as the best sound film ever made for incorporating all elements of cinematic magic.
1952 was the first Sight and Sound poll. Citizen Kane didn't even appear in the first 10. 10 years later, in 62, it won. It won again in 72. By 82, it was way out in front. In 92, well, who knows?
If Citizen Kane is the greatest film of all time, it should reflect the ideal. And the ideal in all art is to create a seamless unity in which style never calls attention to itself as style, but brings forth beautifully and powerfully content. Michelangelo's David, for instance, or Henry Moore's Reclining Nude. On second viewing, perhaps, you might notice that David's fingertips reach his knees. His hands are inhumanly huge, that Michelangelo's humanism is abstract, that Moore's abstractions are downright sexy. But Citizen Kane, who needs a second look? From the first moment of the first viewing, style jumps off the screen and applauds itself. In Citizen Kane, style and content are divorced for irreconcilable differences. And not only divorced, but as in any bad marriage, fighting each other. And style always wins, because style, technique, is what Kane's all about. And this is a terrible indictment, because the unity of form and content, style and substance, is the key to a film's meaning and emotion. We want emotion from a great film, rich emotion, not the easy sensations of violence or sentimentality. We want meaning, but not the dry intellectualisms of an essay. What we want is idea wrapped inside aesthetic emotion. In other words, great art gives us the very thing we cannot get from life. That's why we go to the movies. A fine film should be a kind of equipment for living, and the filmmaker's technique should be the transparent means by which they bring us this enrichment. But the style of Citizen Kane is the very opposite of that. It's opaque, a virtuoso display of camera technique, declamatory symbols, and bravura sound devices, all screaming for attention.
You're fired.
Well, Welles is famous for those deep spaces in the shots where he'll hold something visible simultaneously in the extreme background and the extreme foreground, and then he will key light both objects to bring them out. And that's often praised as kind of a breakthrough into a new way of seeing reality whole rather than cutting it into bite-sized pieces.
Welles and Toland wanted to create, in their words, a greater realism. So they employed a photographic technique that puts everything in focus from near foreground to infinity. This they called deep focus. Toland felt that deep focus imitates the human eye and is therefore more realistic. It caused a lot of talk at the time because, although not an original technique, no one but Welles had ever used it with such intensity and repetition.
If I want, I can go to court.
The photography has probably never been bettered. It's the best black and white photography I've ever seen. And the tremendous depth of focus had a startling effect.
Here's how deep focus works. We're using a normal lens. My face is in sharp focus, the background blurry. Now, if we go to a wide lens, the background becomes a little sharper. Add strong light, stop down the lens aperture, and you've got deep focus. In the foreground, my hand is in sharp focus. In midground, my face as well. Now, if we jib down to the floor, in the background, the ceiling comes into focus too. Why? Because ceilings were very important to Orson Welles. Rooms, after all, have ceilings. And so for a greater realism, he had ceilings built into all the sets, and then had holes cut in the floor so the camera could see them. Welles used deep focus and low angles to stage sequence shots. These are long takes where, with actor and camera movement, the director can devise a series of compositions without cutting. The sequence shot, here's one, was also thought to be truer to life because space is continuous, not fragmented by cuts. All this, then, in the service of a greater realism. Now look closely at this shot. When, in reality, do people ever tower over us? When do we look up their trouser legs? Of course, rooms have ceilings, but who notices? And this tracking, gliding camera. In life, we never drag our eye across space like this. We glance, we edit life. Look, I hold this pen at arm's length. Try this yourselves. I stare at it with both eyes. What happens? The background goes double and out of focus. Now I look at something in the background. The pen goes double and out of focus. I drop the pen and glance down. That glance fragments the space between where it was and where it lands. Because seeing isn't just focusing your eyeball, it's perception, mental focus. No, deep focus isn't reality. Deep focus is theater, the view from the stalls that puts the whole scene in focus. And Orson Welles, a first-time film director, is simply transposing to the screen what he knows best, the stage.
The French film critic André Bazin has argued that in scenes like this, deep focus gives the audience freedom to explore the shot, to look where it wants. This, too, is nonsense. We're not free. Look, Welles is in total command. He knows a dozen ways to control our eye: lighting, movement, height and size of objects, sound, dialogue. We look exactly where and when he wants us to look.
In seeking to create a greater realism, Welles and Tolan have in fact created a greater artificiality. But why not? Citizen Kane wants to be art, and all art by definition is artificial. It's not reality we want, but what the artist expresses about reality. So maybe greater realism was just Welles's rationalization for what he actually wanted, a unique and better way to express content. Let's look at that newsroom clip again.
This image gives these actors a very powerful, heroic presence. Visually, they're dominant, even triumphant. But in fact, they've just suffered the worst defeat of their lives. Kane's been scandalized out of politics, and Leland's abandoning his dearest friend. This composition absolutely contradicts the content of the scene. But maybe Welles saw it as ironic, heroic losers. I don't think so. I think Welles wants us to notice that there's a ceiling.
At other times, Welles ignored his pursuit of realism to show off. This is his first film, and he wants us to know that he knows everything. So we get everything. Montages, dissolves, wipes, echo chambers, multiple images, sound and time jumps. Each one shattering our concentration on story, while Orson Welles shouts, "What a brilliant artist am I." When I said that Welles is in command, I don't only mean of the medium, I mean of us. There's a great principle underlying all fine storytelling, known as show, don't tell, which translates as treat the audience as adults. Don't tell them what to think and feel as if they were children, but show them the living world of your characters and invite them into the ritual of story. Ask them to bring their own wisdom, perception, emotions. Welles, however, has no faith in our intelligence and sensibility as adults. So he sits us on his knee and uses his wonderful technique to explain everything. For example,
Kane signs a declaration of his ideals, but in these sinister shadows, should we trust him, boys and girls? Does he mean what he says? Kane thinks he's headed for the governor's mansion, but watch out. Big boss Jim Geddes is on top of things, and he's got trouble in mind for Kane. Now, here's a marriage with problems.
What are you doing?
No communication. They're so far apart.
Jigsaw puzzles?
Nothing in common. No real feelings for one another.
Charlie, what time is it?
Uh-oh, hear that echo? It's all so hollow.
Citizen Kane is saturated with these visual metaphors. Of course, we want films to be poetic, to use images charged with the power of symbolism. Nothing new to this. Homer did it. Each play of Shakespeare's has a unique image system. This is how great playwrights, novelists, filmmakers have always enhanced their works. But the whole point of narrative poetics is that it must be a subliminal communication to the audience. They're not to notice it. Symbolism only works when it bypasses the rational and touches the unconscious. The moment the audience sees any image as symbolic, the artist has just destroyed the effect. And that's what's wrong with the imagery of Citizen Kane. Its metaphors hit you over the head.
The reflected images mirror Kane's fractured personality. Wow. Oh, and watch this one. The camera, like a voyeur, invades Susan's privacy. The cruel Kane overshadows his wife.
You will continue with your singing.
Get it? Give me a break.
This incessant extravagance of style produces a film that's different. But this is difference for the sake of difference. And that's as empty an achievement as slavishly following commercial convention. It's been said that Citizen Kane is not your typical Hollywood film. I would argue it's pure Hollywood. Energy, extravaganza, technical razzle-dazzle, but ultimately all glitz and no guts.
Song about you, Mr. Kane? You buy a bag of peanuts in this town, you get a song written about you.
What's true of style is just as true of story design. The overall structure is self-consciously clever, needless complication that masquerades as complexity and demands to be taken seriously as art.
It's like a huge bridge to me, a black and white, massive bridge, but it is an architectural shape, whereas most films are flabby and they're like blancmange and they have no shape. And you could take out this scene and put in that scene, it would make no difference.
Citizen Kane is a story within a story within a story. The outer yarn is the quest by the reporter Thompson to find the meaning of Kane's dying words, Rosebud.
Yes, Rosebud. I'm calling just that one word. But who is she?
Within that is the story of Kane's public life, first told in newsreel montage and then repeated throughout the film. The innermost story is told through flashbacks, as each person Thompson interviews gives us a chunk of Kane's private life. And at the heart of the labyrinth lies the MacGuffin, the secret of Rosebud, the sledge we see burning at the end of the film.
It fashionably fragments itself, breaks into different voices, different pieces, different narrative presentations. But does that really make it profound? I mean, it's kind of a superficial mimicry of the modernist experience. But the experience, the knowledge in the film is skin deep.
Indeed. If a writer breaks convention and tosses time like a salad, there can only be one justification: to put something more important in its place. Generally, he wants the effect known as dramatic irony. The writer starts the movie at the ending, as Billy Wilder did in Sunset Boulevard. He answers the question, how will this turn out, then flashes back to encourage the audience to ask the deeper questions. How and why did these characters do what I already know they did? To look for the profound motivations that drive character. But if Welles and Mankiewicz had done that, what would reward our search? Nothing. For the characters of Citizen Kane are such dreadful stereotypes, they might just as well wear signs around their necks.
That even goes for Kane, the great press tycoon. Hell, I've met newsboys with more complex personalities.
So, how do they solve the problem? They promise the pleasures of dramatic irony by starting with the death of Kane. Then tack on Agatha Christie. Invent a mystery. Hire Thompson as detective, do it in flashbacks so that we don't notice they've broken their promise. They had to come up with a gimmick like that because if you take the Thompson plot out of the film, what have you got? Not only a rather drab, melodramatic story, but peopled by characters for whom we can have no empathy. It's the favorite recipe of bad novelists. Take a dull story, chop it into pieces, stir-fry through time, and then serve it up as modernism. What, after all, is the content of Citizen Kane? What does it mean? The critics have proposed 3 different theories and argued about them for 50 years. First, and most famous, the Rosebud theory. That Kane's sad, wasteful life is due to the loss of childhood innocence when he was severed from his mother, as symbolized in the key image of the film, the burning sledge, Rosebud. So the Rosebud theory is that the truth about a human being can be traced to a single childhood trauma, and understanding that we understand everything about them. The second is the enigma theory. Here, the critics expound on the great differences of opinion throughout the film as to who Kane really was, and point to the dialogue in the final scene in which Thompson says a single word could never explain a man's life. Kane is an enigma, and like Kane, no one can really be understood. The third theory is the open theory. In this view, critics claim that the film is not about the meaning of Kane's life, but about the first two theories. They say the film takes the contradiction between these theories and holds it open to promote a discussion on what can or cannot be known about human beings, Kane as a kind of Platonic dialogue. I would like to propose a fourth theory, the bad writing theory, the writer and director who can't agree what their movie's about theory. Mankiewicz came up with the Rosebud idea, and he loved it. Wells hated it. Wells called it what it is, a cheap Freudian cliche. So he rewrote Mankiewicz to add his own cliche, the enigma, in this case, cheap Pirandello. It was Wells who wrote the Thompson dialogue saying one word can't explain a man. Mankiewicz hated that rewrite. He believed in his Rosebud scene. And I must say, audiences actually like the Rosebud revelation. At least it clears up the phony mystery. But it's the Emperor's new clothes. Oscar or no Oscar, this is not great writing. It's the result of a behind-the-screen war that's been fought in thousands of filmmaking ventures and still goes on today. The screenwriter writes a script, fine, but the director isn't happy with it. So he rewrites to graft on his idea. He doesn't bother to write a whole new original script. No, just adds his bit, even if it undermines the screenwriter's idea and creates a muddled film. And yet, in the case of Citizen Kane, for 50 years, this void between Wells and Mankiewicz has been a critic's playground. They have leapt into it to fill it with Freudianisms, Marxism, Derridaism, or is it Derrida-Dadaism? Why then do critics call this the greatest film ever made? Because everything in it that's weak, everything that is superficial, they love. Citizen Kane gives critics exactly what they want, a pretentious theme to argue about and a chance to show off their knowledge of filmmaking by writing ad nauseum about its style.
You can take any sequence out of Citizen Kane and analyze it to hell. You can't do that with many films. There are usually dead moments or orthodox moments. Nothing is orthodox in Kane, so everything repays study.
The film scholars need a work to declare the value of their discipline. They need a work that they can turn to and say, this truly is a masterwork. So in a certain sense, film's desire to legitimize itself as a scholarly field goes hand in glove with the overinflation of Citizen Kane.
But it's more than the politics of criticism. It's mythology. The story of Wells making this film is the saga of the artist versus Hollywood. And critics adore that myth. They have this love-hate thing for Tinseltown. I think they hate themselves for secretly loving Hollywood films. So, the greatest film of all time has to be a Hollywood film. Couldn't be Ingmar Bergman's brilliant Persona, nor Fellini's splendid 8.5, won't do. Nor can it be a people's favorite like Casablanca. No, they need an art movie. Then they can slap Hollywood in the face with it and say, see, you wouldn't know art even if you produced it yourself. When is film criticism going to grow up? Citizen Kane has its pleasures. Style is its content, and there is something to be said for interesting. However, as to the critics' bloated claim that it's the greatest film of all time, no way. And I think Orson Welles would be the first to agree. You know, it's a little disheartening to be told that your first film is your best film and it was downhill from there. In a true masterpiece, style is a transparency that lets us pass through the screen to the heart of the work. Film and audience, the ultimate unity, living together for 2 hours. But Citizen Kane stops our eye at the screen, pushes us away. It doesn't need our embrace. No, it craves critical recognition. And you see, it has us standing here tonight, giving it just what it wants.